Hindu Yuva is a campus organization focused on bringing social cultural events to NC State, and we aim to preserve, promote, and protect Hinduism and all activities that are related to Hinduism on campus. We have several events that we do throughout the year, starting from Makar Sankranti to Holi to Ganesh Utsav, which is our flagship event, to speaker on campus events, which we have done a few times before from all with the help of Medhananda Society here at NC State. We've had Swami Sarvabhiyanandaji, Swami Medhanandaji, Bhagavad, and other speakers from all over the US and India to come here to give talk. And today we are extremely delighted to have Swamiji to give us a talk, and we hope that it will be a very good event. And so I would like to welcome you all to NC State, and I would like to call Akash from Hindu Yuva to introduce.
Namaste everyone. It's a privilege to introduce our distinguished speaker for today, Swami Medhananda, to share insights on Bhagavad Gita and positive psychology. Swamiji is a respected monk of the Ramakrishna order and an esteemed academic philosopher. Swamiji bridges the spiritual and academic world with praise. He serves as a senior researcher fellow in philosophy at the Vedanta Society of Southern California and extends his spiritual guidance as a Hindu chaplain at both the University of California, Los Angeles, and the University of Southern California. Swamiji research focused on the global philosophy of religion, religious epistemology, consciousness, and the rich tapestry of Indian spiritual hermeneutics, focusing on the Vedantic philosophical tradition. As an accomplished author, Swamiji has penned 3 insightful books named as Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, The Dialectics of Aesthetic Agency, Evaluating German Aesthetics from Kant to Eternal. He is also a section editor for the International Journal of Hindu Society, Hindu Studies, overseeing submission in Hindu and cross-cultural philosophy of religion. His academic journey is also marked by a PhD in German aesthetics from the University of California, Berkeley, with a rich experience of captivating lectures at leading universities worldwide. Swamiji brings a wealth of knowledge and perspective to our gathering today. Please join me in warmly welcoming Swami Medhananda to the stage. Also, we would like to present a token of appreciation to Swamiji from the Hindu Yuva team. Therefore, I would like to request our President Dhanush to come to the stage and do the honor. Om Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritangamaya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at NC State University. An honor and a pleasure. Is the sound okay, or?
You're very
Metallic or something. As long as people can hear me. I want to thank the Hindu Yuva for inviting me today, and thank Kamran, Professor Das, for arranging this whole event as well. I appreciate that. So I'm speaking today on
an interesting topic. Both the topics are fertile topics for discussion in their own right. Bhagavad Gita, the most well-known of Hindu religious scriptures, and on the other hand, positive psychology, which is a burgeoning field within contemporary psychology. And I want to bring these two things together, which I don't think is done very often. I want to make a start. There's a lot to say, but I just want to get the conversation rolling. What is positive psychology first? So traditional psychology is interested in, I'm hearing a lot of feedback. Is that normal?
No, it should
I'm hearing my own voice. Yeah. If you could just work on the audio, I'd appreciate it. Thanks. I'll continue.
It's very loud.
So traditional psychology is interested in curing you of mental illness or neurosis, right? So you have some kind of problem, some debilitating depression or neurosis of some sort, anxiety, and it's the job of the psychologist to make you quote unquote normal again. And then the psychologist's job ends there. And positive psychology begins where traditional psychology leaves off, in a sense. Because they say that it's not enough to just be free of mental illness. That's extremely important, but that's not enough. The next step is not just living, not just surviving, not just being normal, but flourishing. Positive psychology is all about how we can flourish in life, how we can live truly fulfilling life. So what I want to argue today is that Bhagavad Gita, this ancient scripture in the Hindu tradition, has a lot to offer in deepening our understanding of how we can live a truly fulfilling life. And on the other hand, so I want to make an argument in both directions. So on the one hand, recent findings in positive psychology by some of the leading scientists corroborate some of the great insights that we find in this ancient scripture, the Bhagavad. And on the other hand, if we look at some of the key ideas in positive psychology now, mainly Western positive psychology, if we look at it from a Vedantic standpoint, and specifically from the perspective of the Bhagavad Gita, we can actually find certain weak spots, weak points, blind spots, areas where Vedanta can actually lend a helping hand, where it can push positive psychology even further, and make suggestions as to sort of paths for making further progress. So I want to focus on a particular book written by the person who is widely considered to be the father of positive psychology. His name is Martin Seligman. He's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And the book I want to focus on is called Authentic Happiness, published in 2002, a little over 20 years ago. He's written other books since, and positive psychology is a vast field, and I can't possibly talk about the whole range of ideas discussed. I'm not going to talk about other major positive psychologists. So I want to focus on this one book, just to give a kind of focus to our talk. So in this book, Martin Seligman distinguishes three different ways of living. He calls the first way of living the pleasant life, a life centered around maximizing pleasure, kind of life of hedonism. The second life is what he calls the good life. And I'll explain what all these things mean in the course of the talk. And the third kind of life is what he calls the meaningful life. And what he says is that the pleasant life is inherently unsatisfying and unfulfilling. And that the key to authentic happiness is to combine the good life with the meaningful life. Okay, this is just, I'm giving a very high altitude summary of the main thesis of his book, Authentic Happiness. And I think these three paradigms for living, the pleasant life, the good life, and the meaningful life, is useful as a way of thinking, first of all, making connections with Bhagavad Gita. And secondly, just in terms of, it's extremely practical. Many of you are students or faculty or spiritual aspirants or some combination of the three. It's very, very important. One of the most fundamental questions is, how do I live a fulfilling life? And I think this book really helps us to answer that question, and obviously Bhagavad Gita does as well. That's what I want to argue. So let's start with the pleasant life. And actually, I'll be spending most of the time today on this first way of living. You'll see why in a second, because it's so dominant. But I wanted to begin by going back in time. Let's jump into a time machine. Go back to the 70s, 1972. Stanford University. A professor named Walter Mischel does a famous experiment called the marshmallow experiment. And he has these very young kids, sits them down, and he tells them, they're about 4 or 5 years old, and he says, he places a marshmallow in front of them, and he says, you can have one marshmallow now, or here's the alternative. I'm going to leave the room. I'll leave you in here for 15 minutes. If you can hold out, if you can restrain yourself from eating that marshmallow for 15 minutes, when I come back, I'll reward you with not one, but 2 marshmallows. Wouldn't that be nice? And these kids are intrigued. And there's a video camera going. And Walter Mischel leaves. And the tape is rolling, and it's really funny to watch these kids. And some of them just immediately eat the one marshmallow. Some of them are on the fence, and so they're really trying to restrain themselves, and they're kind of trying to distract themselves in different ways from not eating the marshmallow. And some succeed in the end. They can hold out the full 15 minutes. The doctor comes back in, and this is what's interesting with the study. It's a longitudinal study, which means that it's a study that spans decades. They looked at the life outcomes of these children, who were only 4 or 5 years old at the time, decades later, when they're in their 20s and 30s and 40s. What they found is astonishing. What they found is that those few kids who could restrain themselves for those 15 minutes, and the overall results is that 2 out of 3 of those kids succumbed. They couldn't hold out for the 15 minutes, and so they ate that one marshmallow. 1 out of 3, the 1/3 of the participants, they were able to restrain themselves, and they got rewarded with the 2 marshmallows. So keep that in mind. So what do they find in terms of this longitudinal study? They found that those who were able to restrain themselves, that 1 out of 3, ended up having much better life outcomes across the board than those who were not able to resist that instant gratification. You might ask, well, on what measures of life outcome? Many different measures, but I'll mention a few. SAT scores, educational attainment, body mass index, so even just keeping themselves healthy, mental health, so on many measures. So what does this tell us? I think this is a good kind of initial entry point. The idea is that those who are able to delay gratification, instead of just succumbing to any form of instant gratification that comes along, they end up happier in life, and they end up leading more fulfilling lives. If you just think about it intuitively, ask yourself, some of you are already advanced in age to some extent, look back in your own life. What were the most fulfilling, satisfying things you achieved? Rarely are you going to say it was that ice cream I had. Those are instant gratifications. They're wonderful when they last, but they're not the things that stay with you. They're the things that you work at, right? Whether it's raising your children well, whether it's, if you're like a scientist or something, is coming up with that breakthrough discovery or something. All that stuff takes a lot of time, and it necessarily involves delaying gratification. You'll find that that's a common denominator across most of these really meaningful things, milestones that happen in our life. Many of your students, studying involves delayed gratification. If your friends are pressuring you to go out for that frat party, and you say, no, I've got to study for this, I've got to hunker down and study for this exam, that's delaying gratification. So you guys, I'm sure, can relate to this well. So why do I mention this experiment from over 50 years ago? Well, because the study is more relevant now than ever. Because I would argue, and I don't think this is really controversial, we live in an unprecedented age of instant gratification. Unprecedented age of instant gratification. I was born in 1980, so pre-internet. And so in the 80s, we would use these as cassette tapes to listen to music. The two sides, flip it. And no internet. And if you heard a song on the radio that you really liked, you'd spend 5 days just trying to track that song down. You can't find it. Now you have Spotify, you've got YouTube, you can find everything instantly. There's Kazam, right? That app where you just put it to the radio and you can figure out what song it is. Everything is instant now. When I was a kid, one of my favorite shows growing up was Seinfeld. And it was a must-see Thursday, I think, on NBC. So you have to wait a week for the next episode. Now, you don't need to wait. You can binge watch an entire season in one day. You can gorge yourself. Instant gratification. This is true across the board. Pornography is ubiquitous now. In the past, you meet somebody, you actually have to go somewhere, like a bar or something, like a singles night. Now there are a million websites where you can meet whoever you want. Social media. Everything is oriented toward instant gratification. And you might think, intuitively, that, well, that's a good thing. What's the problem with that? It means that we get what we want, whenever we want it, and in as much of a quantity as we want, right? Great. Not great. It sounds like it would be good, but in fact, the opposite is the case. The more our society, our culture is saturated with instant gratification, the unhappier we become. That's what all of the findings show. There have been many studies. I'll just mention one. This is a 2023 Mental Health America study called The State of Mental Health in America. And what they're finding is, and this is pre-pandemic, they were doing studies before the pandemic. Over 50 million Americans suffer from mental illness. Millions experience thoughts of suicide. Over 1 in 10 youth in the US are experiencing depression, which is severely impairing their ability to function at school or work, at home or with the family. And as I said, this study was done before the pandemic, but the pandemic has just exacerbated all of these trends. So I think we can, if we want a name for this, we can call it the paradox of instant gratification. You would think that getting exactly what we want, whenever we want it, would make us happier, but in fact the opposite. Why? That's the deep question. This is the question that Vedanta had asked many thousands of years ago. And we get the answer in the Bhagavad Gita, for instance. And now positive psychologists in the West are also trying to answer the same question. Let's start with a book by the Stanford psychotherapist Anna Lemke. She wrote a book in 2021 called Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. What is dopamine? I'm not a scientist, so I can't give you a very technical scientific explanation, but the basic idea, it's considered to be the kind of craving or feel-good chemical, the neurotransmitter. And anytime you do something that's satisfying at the level of instant gratification, so drug addicts and people like that, what they're looking for is that dopamine. There's a rush of dopamine when you indulge in any form of instant gratification. But then ultimately, the dopamine levels come crashing down. And the higher the peak experience, the higher the dopamine goes up, the further you come crashing down, ultimately. Okay, so that's just the nature of the neurochemistry of dopamine. So what's the problem? Instant gratification leads to a spike in dopamine levels, which makes you crave for that dopamine high again and again, so you seek that same experience, but you need more of that experience to get the same dopamine high, because your dopamine tolerance increases the more you indulge. And so it becomes this vicious cycle where you have to have more and more of that instant gratification to get that same dopamine high. And ultimately what happens is that your baseline dopamine levels go way down, which makes you unhappy, just generally. Another concept that's useful that was introduced by positive psychologists called the hedonic treadmill. And it's the same idea. Many people think that right now I make $50,000. If I can only make another $50,000, I'll be twice as happy. This is a very common way of thinking. But in fact, that never happens. And let's say I finally get that $100,000 salary that I was looking for. What happens? My peer group changes. Now the people I hang out with make maybe $200,000. Now I'm not satisfied with 100,000, I need to have 200,000. Now I'm not satisfied with my Lexus, now I want a top-of-the-line Mercedes. You see, so there's no end to desire, that's the problem. That's the hedonic treadmill. People who are lottery winners, hundreds of millions of dollars, they were making $25,000, something there, and you would think they'd be that much happier. They become miserable, in many cases, because now they don't know whom to trust. They don't have any friends. They think that everybody just wants their money, and they don't know what to do with the money. They often squander it. They become bankrupt. There are many issues. And Lemke, in her book, she says that social media is exacerbating this whole problem of craving this dopamine. She says the pull of dopamine, this is a direct quotation, the pull of dopamine is so strong that studies have shown tweeting is harder for people to resist than cigarettes and alcohol. Social media, extremely addictive. And part of the reason is that many of you are techies. You guys are the brains behind social media, because these engineers, brilliant engineers, scientists have developed these algorithms, extremely sophisticated algorithms, to figure out exactly what we like. The moment we click on a video on YouTube or Twitter or Instagram, what happens? That thing kicks back to us 10 more of the same. So it becomes this kind of incessant echo chamber of what we like. And because we like it, we can't help but clicking. And it just gets worse and worse and worse. Another quote from the book. Neuroscientists have compared social media interaction to a syringe of dopamine being injected straight into the system. There have been some experiments done on rats and mice that are interesting in this regard. There's a Swiss scientist named Christian Lucha. What he's done is he puts in the cage a lever, and if the mouse pushes that lever, what happens? It activates the dopamine receptors, and it gets that dopamine out. And he puts the mice in there, and he just watches them. The moment it hits that lever, it gets so addicted to that experience, that dopamine high, it just keeps pushing. And it won't stop. And he says, if after 2 hours we didn't take them out of the cage, they would not eat, they wouldn't drink, and they would probably die quickly, but very happily. And some of you might have kids who are, I remember when I was an undergraduate back, this was a kid who was a world-class swimmer on the way to the Olympics. And then what happened? He became addicted to, at the time, this is big, I don't know if it's big anymore. It's called World of Warcraft. It's a computer game. And he was just sitting in there all day playing that video game. Because it's the kind of game that requires, like, the more you sit there, the better, the more you advance in the game, you know? So it kind of gives you an incentive to kind of just sit in your seat. He wouldn't go to practice. Instead of eating healthy food, he'd run off to the fast food Chinese restaurant across the street, and he ended up getting fat. He messed up his whole life. Instant gratification. Another experiment that this that this Swiss scientist named Christian Lucha conducted with the same mice. What did he do? Same lever on the other side of the cage, but between the mouse and that lever, the dopamine lever, he puts this electrically charged grid. So in order for the mouse to get to the lever, it has to endure a lot of pain, constant pain. And even when it gets the lever, it's still touching the grid. And so every time it hits the lever, it's still feeling that pain. And what does he find? In spite of that terrible shock, the mice will pass through the grid, go over the grid, and keep pushing that lever. Just for that little dopamine. But when they put food there, in place of the dopamine lever, what happens? The mice don't make the effort to cross the grid. It's really fascinating. They'd rather die than cross the grid, but if you present that dopamine lever there where they can trigger their dopamine receptors, if they can get that dopamine high, then they'll cross that grid, in spite of all that pain. You might be thinking, poor mice. And that's true, poor mice. But those mice are us. We're the guinea pigs. It's a kind of global experiment being done on us. That lever takes the form of all the different kinds of instant gratification you find. in day-to-day life, whether that's Netflix or whether that's Instagram, YouTube, so social media, there are a million examples. Beyond that, anything, pornography, all of these are the levers. And the moment you click, you're already sucked in. Once you get sucked into the whirlpool, it's very hard to get out, as many of us know. So now, this is all background. Where does Vedanta fit in? Where does the Bhagavad Gita fit? How might Vedanta help us to navigate this unprecedented age of instant gratification? I think a good place to start is chapter 18 of Bhagavad Gita, verses 37 to 39. So these three verses explain three different kinds of happiness, sukha in Sanskrit. Classified in terms of the three gunas. So what are the three gunas? The term guna is often translated as quality, but I actually think that a better translation would be energies. There's no perfect translation, so we can just use the word guna. But energy I like because energy can manifest in different forms, and I think that's very true of these gunas. So sattva guna is the energy that manifests as many different kind of very spiritually positive qualities and ethically positive qualities, like being compassionate, being humble, being contemplative, having kind of an innate spiritual or devotional temperament. All these are sattvic qualities. The energy of rajas, by contrast, manifests as things like restlessness, egoism, arrogance, ambition, and many other attachment. Drama queens are very rajasic. Tamas, the energy of tamas, manifests as depression, laziness, procrastination, oversleeping, these kinds of things. So let's begin, because remember, I'm now just explaining the first of the three ways of living, the three paradigms of living. This is the pleasant life, a life based on hedonism, maximizing instant gratification, maximizing pleasure. So, Rajasika happiness is the relevant form of happiness here. It's 18.38, so chapter 18, verse 38. Krishna says, Vishayendriya sanyoga yattat agre vritopamam pariname vishamiva tatsukam rajasam. Rajasika happiness is happiness that derives from the contact of the sense organs with sense objects. In the beginning, sense pleasure is like nectar, but eventually it becomes like poison. So Gita, long back, understood the fundamental logic of instant gratification and explained it in an even deeper way than I think even contemporary positive psychology does. Because it traces it to rajas, this energy of rajas. And it says that any form of instant gratification, anything involving the contact of the sense organ with the sense objects, or any kind of sense pleasure, is going to be nectar in the beginning. Wonderful. You'll get that momentary high. But inevitably, it'll be followed by coming down. It'll become like this. So don't get sucked in. That's the basic message. So then you might ask, well, why? Why is that the case? Explain this logic. Why are all forms of instant gratification nectar in the beginning and poison in the end? Sri Aurobindo, in his commentary on the Gita, on this particular verse, he says it really nicely. He says, Rajasika joy is nectar to the lips at first touch, but there is a secret poison in the bottom of the cup. And after, the bitterness of disappointment. So he's going to give a laundry list of the different ways that, in the end, this nectar becomes like poison. Disappointment. I was expecting something. I was expecting to get something really great out of this, but in the end, not as great as I was expecting. Satiety. I've had enough. Fed up. You indulge too much, and you actually get almost sick of yourself. You're kind of disgusted with it. Fatigue. You get tired. Revolt. Disgust. It can often make us do terrible things as well. Sin. Suffering. Loss. Transience in the end. This is the most fundamental problem with all forms of instant gratification. They're temporary, they don't last. That's why the first noble truth, everything is suffering. And everything, why is everything suffering? Because everything is anitya, impermanent. That's what the Buddha taught. So, Vedanta says, it gives an even deeper answer, and we have to go to a different scripture to get this deeper answer. Bhagavad Purana. There's a famous story, but I'll just quickly recap it. There's a king named Yayati, who was a big bhogi, somebody who loves rajasika forms of happiness. He's leading the ultimate pleasant life. He's got many wives and concubines and lots of money, living his life to the fullest. But he's still not satisfied. So what does he do? He lines up his sons and he says, which one of you will exchange your youthful body with mine so I can continue with my pleasant life for much longer than I can in this body? And his youngest son is the one who volunteered. Young obedient son says, I'll give you, let's exchange body. So, takes his son's body, continues to enjoy for many, many more years. In the end, finally he experiences what Sri Aurobindo calls satiety and disgust. Finally, enough is enough. And then he has this wonderful insight. He says, Na jatu kamaha kamana upabhogyena shamyam abhisha krishnavatmeva bhuya eva vivaka. Desire is never satisfied through enjoyment. And this is the insight that he came to, finally. After, these are exaggerated figures in the Puranas, we get these messages. After thousands of years of enjoyment, you realize it. You think that if you could just, you have a desire, you get the object of desire, and that you'll be happy. Never happens. What happens instead? Imagine there's a fire. What happens if I throw oil into that fire? Fire will increase. I'm trying to extinguish the fire, and I'm doing the opposite. In India, it's not oil, it's ghee. Right? It's the same idea. Clarify. That's the problem. When we gratify one desire, what happens? The desire itself grows stronger, or the desire multiplies. Now we have an even greater desire, which we can't fill. Schopenhauer, the great German philosopher, he was influenced by Vedanta, so it's not a coincidence, but he says it very beautifully, so I just wanted to read a beautiful passage from his The World as Will and Representation. He says, every satisfied desire gives birth to a new desire. No possible satisfaction in the world could suffice to still our craving, set a final goal to our demand, and fill the bottomless pit of our hearts. So, according to Vedanta, and according to Bhagavad Gita, what's the way out of this vicious cycle? The way out is not to try to satisfy every desire that we have, but to minimize our wants. And one mistake that we often make, and it's very easy to make this mistake in this day and age of instant gratification, is mistaking wants for needs. This is a huge problem. And we're not even to blame, really, because we're living in a capitalist society, and capitalism is deeply invested. The advertising industry is deeply invested in convincing you, in deluding you, into thinking that what's actually just a want is actually a need. None of us really needs that third, whatever, car or boat, or, but we think we need it. We must have it. And then we click on that Amazon buy button, and we get it, and we'll not have it. And then we want the fifth one, sixth. So the entire society is oriented toward making us confuse what are basically wants, which are not necessities, but making us think that they're actually needs, that we absolutely must have them. We can't live without them. So the first thing for spiritual aspirants to do is to clearly distinguish between wants and needs. Filter out all that noise that we're getting from the advertising industry, from society, from our friends, and all that. And ask ourselves what we really need. What do we really need? Not that much. That's why India has a great history of people who, great saints, who show how little they can live on. The aim is not to just practice these kinds of bodily austerities, but it just shows we have very few needs. We need to eat a little for the body to survive, and have basic shelter, food, clothing, and shelter to just live. Beyond that, many of these things are just wants rather than needs. I want to mention another great Vedantic text. This is called Vairagya Shatakam. 100 verses on detachment, written by Bhagavad, who was a king who later became a renunciate. So after he became a sannyasi, a renunciate, he gave a beautiful new definition of what true wealth is and what true poverty is. He says, Sattu bhavati daribro, yasya krishna vishal, manasi cha paritushte kortavan kodana. That person is poor, truly poor. Don't judge the poverty of somebody based on their bank balance. That person is truly poor whose desires are great. That's the true definition of poverty. Elon Musk, the richest person in the world, but he may be poor in this sense. Well, he may be. I don't know. I don't know him well. I haven't met him. But it depends on whether his desires are greater than what he actually has. And somebody who makes $25,000 a year, but who doesn't have great desires, that person is wealthier than Elon Musk. And then the second line, when the mind is contented, who is rich and who is poor? The contentment of the mind is the most important thing, not how many material possessions we have, how much money we have. So that's all. This was all just explaining that first, the pleasant life. And I hope I've already began to show how Bhagavad Gita can give us really helpful insights into what the problems are in leading a life oriented around hedonism, around maximizing instant gratification. What about the good life? Martin Seligman, this very prominent contemporary positive psychologist, he says that instead of leading a pleasant life, that doesn't mean you have to cut all pleasures out of your life. It means that your main aim should not be maximizing instant gratification, right? Instead, you should try to live what he calls the good life. He gets a term from Aristotle, but he explains it in a simple way, and I think it's very useful. What's the good life? Follow 2 steps. First step, identify your signature strength. What are your strongest talents? What are your best strengths? What brings out the best in you? That's the first thing there. Secondly, find a calling, find a vocation that best helps you to cultivate those and make use of those signature strengths on a day-to-day basis. You see how relevant this is for people, especially in a university setting, for students, for faculty, for parents, for kids. Often what happens is we choose the wrong major, or we choose the major for the wrong reasons. Or we pick a career that's not really suited to us for the wrong reasons. What are those wrong reasons? Any number of reasons. It could be parental pressure. It could be prestige, right? I mean, different societies value different kinds of careers and different kinds of subjects. In India, I lived in India for 13 years. I just came back from India a few years ago. There, the best students typically go into science subjects, as most of you know, actually. And if you do really badly on this 10th grade exam, what's called the Madhyamika, then you go into what's the dreaded arts, which means humanities, which I studied. And there's a whole movie, there's a very famous Bollywood movie, which many of you probably have seen, called 3 Idiots, about this, right? There's a guy whose passion, whose strength is wildlife photography. But his dad pushes him into engineering. But he's unhappy. And so part of the story is about tracking how he musters the courage to actually do what he loves, in spite of his dad being furious. I went through the same thing. You know, my dad made me enroll at Berkeley as a computer science major. And after a year, I changed to philosophy and English literature. And I was miserable when I was in computer science. There's nothing wrong with the subject, but it just didn't align with my signature strength. I knew that in my heart of hearts, but it took me a full year to get the courage to confront my dad about it and break it to him. And he was not happy, believe me, but he's come around. So, the good life, based on these 2 steps. Identify your signature strengths, find a vocation, a calling that helps you to cultivate those signature strengths on a regular basis, If we can do that, what happens? Magic happens. There's another prominent psychologist, positive psychologist, whose name is very difficult to pronounce. Mihail Csikszentmihalyi. He wrote a very important book called Flow. And what he says is, when you're really deeply concentrated in something you love, in an activity that you love, you enter a state of what he calls flow. And it's characterized, there are a number of things that characterize it, but one thing is that it feels timeless, like you lose sense of time. It's one thing. And number two, how does he explain it? He says, it's like this. You're doing something that fully engages you, your creative and intellectual faculties, so it's challenging. If it weren't sufficiently challenging, what would happen? You'd be bored. You wouldn't be able to enter the flow state. If it's too challenging, you're not up to the task and you'll get frustrated. So you have to hit the sweet spot, that it has to be challenging but not too challenging. And your abilities need to meet the challenge, right? And so if you hit that sweet spot, what happens? You enter the state of flow. That's where true fulfillment occurs. And Bhagavad Gita does exactly the same thing. And it said it many hundreds of years ago in the concept of swadharma. Swadharma. Sri Aurobindo translates swadharma as one's own law of being, which I really like. What is your own? Each one of you has your own law of being. What makes you tick? What are your fundamental strengths? And what Krishna says is, each one of us, as spiritual aspects, should determine our swadharma by analyzing our two things, our gunas and our karma. Guna, karma. These are the two terms used in Sanskrit. Guna means our innate strengths or innate qualities, our innate disposition, temperament. And karma means our behavior, external behavior, how we interact with others, how we live in the world, that kind of stuff. Look at both those things. Analyze yourself. Ask your loved ones. Often they're more honest than we are with ourselves. We might delude ourselves into thinking that we're great at painting. And your wife or husband can bring you down to earth and say, no, you're not as good as you think you are. It often helps to have somebody, or a best friend or someone, to help you. So Gita says, same thing as Seligman. First, figure out your inherent strengths, your signature strengths. Then, find a calling that aligns with those signature strengths. And the much maligned caste system in Hinduism, for good reason, I mean, it's an abused thing, but in the Bhagavad Gita, Varna, caste, was not based on heredity. It's based on guna and karma. And it's very logical. A well-functioning society with the aim of everybody's maximal spiritual fulfillment is one that allows us and encourages us to find a line of work that best aligns with our signature strengths. That's all that the ancient original caste system involved. It later degenerated into the hereditary caste system that we have now, and that's where all the evils come from. The abuse and the privilege, the persecution. But the original idea, I think, is very confirmed by the insights of contemporary positive psychology. Swabhava niyatam karma, that's another term used in the Gita, in chapter 18. You should find the work that is swabhava niyatam, that is in accordance with your swabhava. It's very similar to swadharma. The idea is, it's your own law of being. And if you can find that, you're going to discover fulfillment in life. But there's something missing, I think, from Martin Seligman's account of the good life. He's mentioned these two steps. One, identify your signature strengths. Number two, find a vocation that helps to cultivate those signature strengths. Bhagavad Gita adds a third step, I would suggest. That third step, analyze your inner attitude, the motive. What's the motive with which you do the work? Seligman doesn't, as far as I can tell, he doesn't ask that question. Very, very important. What's the attitude with which you engage in this work? Even if this is exactly the work that you're suited for, there's a heaven and hell difference in doing it in a very selfish and egoistic way and doing it on a spiritual basis. So let me try to lend some concretion to that. What do I mean by that? In an early chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. There's one of my favorite verses. Mayi sarvani karmani sanyasya dhyamkyet nirashi nirmamo bhutva yuktasva vigatatva. Giving up all of your actions to me, says Bhagavan Krishna. Focus on your inner Atman. Nirashi nirmamo bhutva, being free from egoism and free from expectations. I want this, I have to achieve this and that. Yuktasva vigatatva. You should fight, but devoid of the fever of egoism. Devoid of the fever of selfishness. It's all about the inner attitude. So what Gita is saying is it's not enough to find and to engage in the kind of work that helps us to cultivate our signature strength. You have to convert that work into karma yoga. You have to convert karma into karma yoga. Karma just means work. Karma yoga means work as a spiritual practice. Work as a means of making spiritual progress and helping us to ultimately reach enlightenment, which has been variously described as self-realization or God-realization. Let me give you a simple example that's relevant to an academic context. If you're a student, you have to study for exams often, right? Let's say that you're a very good student. You do really well on exams. Even so, let's imagine two different scenarios. One scenario is you're doing the studies, but not as a spiritual practice. You're doing it as karma rather than karma yoga. What will that look like? It'll look like this, roughly. I'm a good student, and so I kind of think highly of myself. And I might even look down on my other students, on the other people preparing for the same exam, thinking like, poor suckers, they have to study 5 times as much as I do, and I'm probably going to do better than them. Ego. Right? I'm very ambitious. What's my main motivation? I want the highest score in the class, so I can brag to my friends, so that the scores will be posted. I don't know if they do this anymore. In the past, they would post the results. They may not give the names, they give the student ID number so that it's kind of hidden. But anyway, I want to be number 1. That's my ambition. Right? And what happens if I don't do as well as I wanted? I'll be miserable. I'll be dejected for weeks. I might not be able to get out of bed. Right? I'm fulfilling everything that Martin Seligman is telling me to do. Aren't I doing what I'm good at? Yes. I'm not happy enough. Right? Now let's contrast that with another kind of student. Also very good student. But the inner attitude is completely different. This person has a spiritual attitude in preparing for the exam. What does that mean? It means that person's going to do his or her best. That's the main aim. I'm going to do my best. But I'm doing this as a service to the divine, and I'm not going to get attached to the fruits of what I'm doing. So I'm not going to become obsessed with what grade I'm going to get, whether I succeed or fail. I'm going to do my best, and I'll leave the rest. So there's a common expression in India: do your best, leave the rest. This is the attitude of a karma yogi. And I'm not that attached to the work either. So there are 2 things that you should avoid attachment to. Number 1 is you shouldn't be attached to the fruits of your action. Success or failure and so on. Name and fame, recognition, all these things. From others. But secondly, even if you've overcome that attachment to the fruits of your actions, you can still get caught in another kind of attachment. If they're on vacation for 2 days, they can't help but think about their work. That shows that they're too attached to the work, right? So that's also, so you should also cultivate attachment toward the work. Okay? But that's a more spiritual attitude. You take the ego out of the work, and you renounce attachment to the work itself and to the fruits of the actions. And then what happens? It doesn't mean that you're going to be a mediocre student who's very egoistic and ambitious. You see. But even if you don't succeed, go into a tailspin of depression. You see? So I think that's the third key step that is missing from contemporary positive psychology. After you identify your signature strengths, after you find your vocation, 3, you have to purify and spiritualize the inner attitude with which you engage in that. It's extremely important. Try as much as possible to take the I, the egoism, the selfishness out of that work, and to make it from spiritual practice instead. And finally, this is the third kind their paradigm of living. Martin Seligman said something interesting. He says, even the good life is not quite enough. Even if you're not leading an ordinary pleasant life, a life based on maximizing pleasure, even if you're doing exactly what he says in order to have a good life, he says, even that's not enough. Your life should not just be a good life, it should be a meaningful life. And what he means by meaning is having some purpose bigger than yourself. And he defines it vaguely on purpose. The reason being that he himself is not a card-carrying kind of religious person or even spiritual particularly. So he wants to make that category very broad. And he includes things like social activism, environmental activism, anything, living for any purpose beyond yourself fits the bill. And here again, what I would suggest is that Vedanta, I think, would say that that's too broad. And that a truly meaningful life is one that has a transcendental purpose. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. But what's the problem then? What's the problem with leading a life with the main aim of, let's say, environmental activism? This is one simple example. The problem is this. Swami Medhananda used to say, the world is like a dog's curly tail. Every time we straighten out the tail, what happens? It curls back up again. You can never find perfection in this world. You can spend your whole life engaging in activism, and I'm not saying not to. It's a wonderful thing. We need it. We need more people who are. So I'm not trying to dissuade anyone. But that can't be the ultimate purpose in life. Because no matter how much effort you make, it'll never be good enough. So if you can't perfect the world, we should try to perfect ourselves. That's what we're not doing. Each one of us not only can perfect ourselves, each one of us will eventually become perfect in the end. Every single one of us, without exception. You might be wondering how that's possible. Because we believe in many lifetimes. Karma and rebirth. I'm writing a book now on karma and rebirth in Hinduism. Spiritual life is a journey of many, many lifetimes. Countless lifetimes. We've lived many times in the past. We will live many times in the future until we attain absolute spiritual and ethical perfection. Every single one of us. And nobody will be left out. But for some of us, it'll take many thousands more lifetimes. Another person, maybe in this life. We're on the same marathon, 26.2 miles. Some people haven't even left the starting line. Other people, mile 1. Other people, 13. Other people, 25.2. They've got 1 mile to go. But we're all on the same journey. So what do I mean by a transcendental purpose? Something beyond the senses. This is the way that Swami Vivekananda defined transcendental item. Something that is not perceivable by the senses. It's very broad still. You'll see. He's not saying God. God is one thing that you can live for. That's beyond the senses. But it's not the only thing. Our own deeper self is also transcendental. What do I mean by that? Beyond this physical body, beyond even the mind, is the deeper soul within. And if we can make the aim of our life the realization of our true nature as eternal souls, as sparks of the divine, then we're leading a truly meaningful life, according to Bhagavad. But now, the million-dollar question. How do we attain this ultimate transcendental aim? How do we realize our true self? How do we realize the divine? Gita is one of the reasons I like the text so much, the scripture. I'm teaching class at USC on Bhagavad Gita. I'm also teaching a separate class in our Hollywood Vedanta Society. I love the text. And part of the reason is because the Gita, at the end of every chapter, when you chant it traditionally, there's what's called a colophon. Om Tat Taditi Srimad Bhagavad Gita Su Upanishatu Brahma Vidyayam Yoga Shastra. Use these terms to explain what the Gita is. Two terms. Brahma Vidya. It teaches the highest knowledge of Brahman. It's a science of Brahman. And it's also the greatest Yoga Shastra. It's an extremely practical spiritual manual. And it's equally both. There are very few spiritual texts which are equally highly philosophical and spiritual and highly practical at the same time. The Gospel of Sri Krishna is another example. but I'm biased. So, Gita gives us very practical advice as to how we can attain spiritual fulfillment. The practical advice is this. Gita has already explained to us the problem with rajasika pleasures, the pleasant life, because they're like nectar in the beginning, but ultimately become like poison. So what should we do? We should try as much as possible to replace rajasika forms of happiness with sattvika forms of joy. That's it. Just remember this. This is one of the main takeaway points from this topic. What do I mean by sattvika forms of happiness? 18.37, chapter 18, verse 37. Yat tat agre vishamidam, pariname nirtodamam, tattukam sattvikam proktam, atma buddhi prasadam. Sattvika joy is joy that is born of the satisfaction of the higher mind and soul, the Atma. Sattvika joy is like poison in the beginning, but eventually it becomes like nectar. So it's exactly the opposite structure of Rajasika, which is like nectar in the beginning, like poison in the end. This is like poison in the beginning, but nectar in the end. And it's a very expressive and evocative Sanskrit phrase used at the end of this book. Atma buddhi prasadajam. All sattvika joy is born, of what? Atma buddhi prasada. The satisfaction, the prasada of Atma and Buddhi. It's a qualitatively different kind of happiness. Why? Because rajasic forms of happiness gratify the ego and gratify the body and the mind. Sattvika forms of joy gratify the deeper soul within. So every time we engage in a more sattvic activity, from which we derive a more sattvic kind of joy, what happens? We gradually erode our identification with the psychophysical complex, with the body and with the mind. And we slowly start to identify with our deeper spiritual nature. Because ultimately all joy, true joy, is within. You see, that's the deepest reason why we can never be satisfied with rajasic forms of happiness, instant gratification. Because that joy is external. It's a chemical thing that happens in the head. Dopamine spikes and all that. You can explain it neurochemically. Sattvika joy is not about that. It works at a much deeper spiritual level. It gratifies the soul. So it's not about ego gratification. It's not about gratifying body or mind, but gratifying the soul. That's what makes it qualitatively a different kind of happiness. So, what are some examples? Of sattvika forms of happiness? Spiritual practice. Many of you probably are spiritual aspirants. Many of you are even in a particular spiritual tradition. Some of you have received what's called spiritual initiation, diksha. Often that involves getting a mantra, repeating that mantra, and that's called the practice of japa, mental repetition of a mantra given to you by your guru. Often, what happens, you get the initiation. The first week or two after initiation, I call that the spiritual honeymoon period. Because you're super excited because you got this new mantra, and you start chanting it a couple times, and you already think you've got a realization or something. You feel really good. But after that honeymoon period wears off, 1 or 2 weeks, give or take, what happens? You come down to earth, you look at it and say, wait a minute, I didn't kidding myself. And secondly, the practice starts to feel mechanical, dry, and you start wondering, is this working or is this? Maybe I should get a new mantra. This is a very common thing after a few months or weeks. People get tired of the mantra. They go to their guru again. Say, I want a new mantra. It's not working. It's like sometimes it becomes like drudgery, poison in the beginning. But if you stick with it, if you persist, and if you try your best to bring some genuine feeling in you, we have to be very careful with spiritual aspects because spiritual life can easily become mechanical and dry. So how do we infuse it with life? We want to make sure that we have what Sri used to call longing, genuine longing, intense longing for spiritual realization. Vyakula. So try to bring some feeling into the spiritual practice. One way that we can do that very easily is praying in private to God. Because prayer, especially Sri used to say, pray with tears in your eyes. Because that's a sign of sincerity. You're not just going through the motions of prayer, you're praying from the heart, right? That's the most important. Eventually, if you stick with it, and if you have that genuine feeling, that spiritual feeling, what happens? What was originally poison becomes like nectar. And you wake up and the first thing you want to do is sit for meditation. That means you're beginning to develop a taste for sattvic forms of joy. Another example, this might be more surprising to you, but physical exercise. You might think this is a paradigm of rajas. This is very rajasic. There's an element of rajas because it involves moving the body, obviously. But again, it all depends on your inner attitude. And if you go to a gym, you'll find many people it's kind of like a place where they can check people out and find their potential, their partner, and this and that, and show off how big their biceps are. That's more of a worldly attitude, we can say. But there's another attitude. The attitude is, I am engaging in physical exercise for my physical and my mental health. And I'm doing it as a way of keeping the body healthy so I can engage in spiritual practices and realize the highest of life, which is spiritual fulfillment. And study after study has shown that physical exercise, regular physical exercise, is 1.5 times more effective than prescription psychiatric medicine in helping to alleviate mental illnesses like depression and anxiety. And there's a recent study that came out which actually suggests that a first-line treatment for mental illnesses like depression is not prescription antidepressants, but physical exercise. First tell your patient, do regular physical exercise. Then if that doesn't work, then you can prescribe medicine. I'm not saying that prescription medicines are wrong, but often they're non-medicine-based ways of treating these problems at a more fundamental level, and that's one of them. And again, what's the attitude with which you do the physical exercise? I'm a jogger. I love jogging. I went for a long jog this morning, and when I jog, I like to repeat the mantra while I'm jogging. So you can do the japa while you're jogging. You can actually synchronize the mantra with the breath, with the way your legs are moving. It depends on the activity too. Swimming is good. I'm a swimmer too. So swimming, you can synchronize it with a stroke. You see, instead of always having the earbuds in there and listening to some music. Speaking of music, that's another thing. What kind of music do you listen to? So you really have to go into the nitty-gritty of your daily life. Examine yourself. Don't look at other people, look at yourself. There's always a danger of judging others and kind of letting yourself off the hook. Turn the mirror toward yourself and analyze everything you do from waking up to sleeping. And ask yourself, what kind of music do I listen to? Is it all pop music and this kind of stuff? Bring in some more sattvic music. What do I mean by sattvic music? Much of classical music in the Indian tradition, but also in the West. What's called sacred classical music. This is more sattvic. Why? Because it gratifies the soul rather than the ego. What kind of movies do you watch? There are sattvika films. Satyajit Ray, good example of sattvic filmmaker. Ingmar Bergman, the great Swedish filmmaker. There are many other examples. Andrei Tarkovsky. Versus the latest Hollywood blockbuster. Okay, so let me just summarize, because I think I've already gone over. I would suggest that Vedanta, and more specifically Bhagavad Gita, makes three major contributions to this burgeoning, nascent field of positive psychology. The first is in the context of the good life. Martin Seligman talks about how we should identify our signature strengths, step one. Step two, find a vocation that helps us to cultivate those signature strengths. The third step, which is missing, I think, and which is sorely needed, is analyze the inner attitude with which you do that work and try to make it as spiritual as possible by trying to take the ego, the I, the selfishness from the work. And try not to get so attached to the fruits of the work. That's the first contribution. Secondly, whereas many positive psychologists are contented saying that any higher purpose can make your life meaningful, I would say that Vedanta says that that purpose needs to be a transcendent. Something not perceivable by the senses. Why? Because we can never make the world perfect, no matter how. And third, try to make everything in your life as sattvic. This is the third very practical tip that Vedanta gives us. Because if we can do that, if we can make the music we listen to more sattvic, the movies we watch more sattvic, our relationships, that's a whole other lecture, but how do we relate to our loved one, our partner, our spouse, or whoever? How do we relate to our children? There's a very Rajasic way of relating to a spouse, which is full of drama and emotion and attachment and anger. There are flares of emotion and this and that. And there's a more sattvic way, where you see yourself as kind of partners on the same path. C.S. Lewis would contrast a face-to-face relationship where everything is very intense, where you forget about the world. That's full of drama and grudges. And then there's living with your partner side by side, where you see yourself as kind of spiritual partner. That's a more sattvic attitude. With your children, are you kind of overbearing, one of those helicopter parents? Or do you give your kids breathing space, room to grow in their own way? That's more sattvic. And we can go on. Analyze everything you do in the course of your day. Try to make it as sattvic as possible. Thank
you, Swamiji, for such nice lecture. Now, for the question and answer session, we'll have 10-minute Q&A, and people at the front can come up here and ask the question, and people at the back can just raise in their hand, and we'll reach out to the people.
Question? Anybody? Please come in. Tell me your name first.
My name is Deborah. Yeah, it is echoing. So I had two interrelated questions.
Yeah.
So regarding the marshmallow test, for instance,
Yeah.
like several studies later on also did, different socioeconomic groups, and that seems to show that children who are like coming from, let's say, poorer backgrounds would have more difficulty because the idea of gratification becomes very different. Like you don't know whether you'll get the next marshmallow or not. Yeah. So I mean, in some sense, thinking of it in terms of karma, So I mean, some people in that sense may not are at a disadvantage when it comes to pursuing the path. So how does one then get to a more sattvic state when there are these disadvantages that one has? And secondly, with respect to identifying one's swadharma, again, like because of like one's karma, one's swabhava itself is turned in ways which is going to hamper one's spiritual journey, then again how does one move towards the different steps that you had outlined? Because there seems to be an assumption that one knows one's what is good. Yeah. So
That's part of the challenge. The first challenge is figuring out what your swabhava is.
Right.
Often we go wrong there because we listen to our parents too quickly, or right. But,
yeah. So even if like because we also say that irrespective of, let's say, what work one is involved in, if one is able to channelize one's attitude correctly, then any work one is involved in might.
That's not what I was talking about exactly, though. Because what I'm saying is, secret restraints would make them a great doctor, and they end up becoming a lawyer. That's not a recipe for success, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, I mean these.
Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah, the first question I really like, and I've thought about this actually. It's not as simple as the way I explained it, because there have been subsequent studies done on different socioeconomic groups, as you pointed out. And the verdict is still out in terms of kind of what the results of these studies are. It's complicated because there's another guy who ran a similar experiment recently called Oseko, I think. And he actually did confirm the results of the previous study. So it's controversial if you go into the weeds. And I think you're right that, yeah, for people who are worried about their next meal, obviously there's a reason why they're going to take that one marshmallow. Maybe they don't trust the doctor who's leaving the room. I don't know that he's going to come back and give you 2 marshmallows, right? That kind of thing. Yeah, still, one thing I'll say is, even among those who are disadvantaged socioeconomically, you'll find that there's a huge range in terms of their life outcomes, depending on how much they were able to delay instant gratification. You'll find that in the absolute poorest circumstances and environments, you'll find that some people, especially those who are prone to kind of saying like, being very kind of like having a low self-esteem and blaming the system on everything, it's a kind of vicious cycle where they're not going to ever come out of it, right? But if you believe in yourself, and if you really feel that you have that strength within, you can overcome adversities to a certain extent. I'm not saying that you're a perfectly blank slate, but I think that it still helps to have an attitude of taking responsibility for yourself, and you can make progress in that. And the second question, I'm not entirely sure what the second question was about Swabhava. Can you say it quickly?
So,
Yeah.
mostly in terms of identifying one's Swabhava, like, especially when one has all these different environmental factors, let's say,
Right.
blocking it, so how
Sure.
do you go about
Yeah, right. Just a couple of questions. One is how to identify my signature strengths. That is a little bit easier to answer. One thing, as I said, is if you're not your own best judge, you can ask a loved one, somebody you trust, whether it's a best friend or a spouse or something like that. But secondly, there are universities, there are career counselors, people who have you fill out questionnaires. There's one online that I use, which I found very helpful actually, and it was pretty accurate as far as I can tell. It spit out my top 5 signature strengths. It's one that was developed by Martin Seligman's group. It's called like VIA Character Strength YouTube data. So you can fill it out yourself, it's free. And that can help you to identify your signature strengths. But the question you were asking is more, again, about the socioeconomic side of it. And again, I would say, yeah, of course, it's absolutely true that there's some people who are meant to be, let's say, a wildlife photographer. But because of their circumstances, they don't have the luxury to do that as a career, right? And that's very sad, of course. And I'm not going to pretend to have the answers to all these like very, very deep systemic social problems. So I can't say anything. But as I said, what the Gita is projecting is an ideal society in which that wouldn't be a problem, right? Of course, that's an ideal society. It's not the one we live in. But that's at least something that we should be working toward. Trying to have a society in which everybody can pursue the vocation that they're best suited. Thank you. Your name?
My name is Vic, like Victor.
Yeah.
Anyway, my question is about reincarnation. So, do you believe in reincarnation?
Yeah, rebirth. We say yeah.
So, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? What is that like?
It means that each of us is a soul which will take up another body in a subsequent lifetime.
All right. So why? So we're just going to keep living on forever.
Well, no. Well, it depends. There's what's called the aim, according to Vedanta, is moksha, liberation from this cycle.
Unity with God.
Huh?
Is it like unity with the mind?
There are different ways of explaining that final state of liberation, depending on which tradition we're talking about.
Yeah.
So, Bhakti traditions will say that the ultimate goal is dwelling in an eternal, loving relationship with your beloved form of the deity in some kind of transcendental, eternal loka or heaven.
Okay.
Whether that's Vishnu Loka or Loka. But Advaita Vedanta, for instance, says that's not the goal. And the goal is just to rest in your true nature as a non-dual pure consciousness. There's no coming, there's no going, there are no eternal heavens. And then there are traditions like the one I belong to, the tradition of Ramakrishna, which I like to put it this way, that it's a both-and tradition rather than either-or. So it embraces both kinds of ideals and says, take your pick. And he would say that bhaktas, devotees of the personal God, they like to eat sugar, whereas Advaita Vedantins, followers of the path of knowledge, they like to become sugar. So eating sugar and becoming sugar are the two main paradigms of liberation, and either one is fine.
So you don't have that. Okay. So if we live on forever, and forever we just get rebirth and stuff like
Well,
that.
who's the we here? That's part of
Like
the question.
individuals, everybody.
No, so Advaita Vedanta denies that. It says that ultimately the individual is false. It's an illusion.
So your soul is on forever.
No, even that, they deny any individual soul. Advaita Vedanta, I'm giving you an example of one tradition within the vast religion of Hinduism. Huh?
What is Ramakrishna?
As I said, he accepts both. And he says it's a matter of temperament. And he says, take your pick. Do you want to merge your individuality in non-dual Brahman? If so, you can do that. And for you, that will be the state of liberation. You will no longer be an individual soul.
All right.
If you want to dwell with your beloved form of God, you can do that. And then you retain individuality. Not as our empirical ego, like you talking to me, and not like that. But there's a deeper individual soul, which, see, in order to enjoy the bliss and love of God, you have to maintain some separation from God. To be in a relationship, there has to be two things, X and Y. right? But that's the idea.
Alright, the reason why I was asking this
Yeah.
is because I read the Bhagavad Gita, or tried to read parts of it from a guy named A.C. Dana, and in
Oh, Prabhupada, yeah.
yeah, I read this part from chapter 2. It said, and basically what the book's about, Arjuna tries to fight a civil war, and he needs to replace this king who's unworthy with another guy, and he has to fight against his people who are like his brothers and his family. Is that
Yeah.
correct? So in the book it states, Bhagavad Gita 2:11, you speak sincerely, but your sorrow is no cause. Wise are you neither for living or the dead. Wherefore Arjuna fight this battle, one believes he is the slayer, another believes he is the slain, both are ignorant, therefore neither slayer nor slain. And he goes on like this for up until like Bhagavad 2:27. It says death is inevitable for living, birth is inevitable for dead.
Okay, but let's try to cut it, get to the chase.
Alright, my point is, from the looks of it, the only reason why he's talking about reincarnation, it's like he utilizes justification to essentially kill people and not feel any remorse for it because it's no different from changing clothes, because these people are going to die anyway, so if you kill them, you're just putting them into another life. And then chapter 11, it talks about, I'm restored of all evil, all that other stuff. In 11:34, and this is the last thing I will state, last verse, one sentence. Kill those whom I have killed, God is saying unto Arjuna, do not hesitate, fight this battle, and you will conquer your enemies. So he's essentially saying, like, I've already killed these people,
Yeah.
you are nothing more but my instrument to
Right.
kill these people.
Nimitta
You have no remorse. It seems like they're utilizing this reincarnation as a way of giving Arjuna a reason to justify killing people without remorse. And that
Yes.
seems like insane. So
Yeah,
let me just-
it's a very reasonable worry to have, and you're not the first to have this concern. Amartya Sen, Nobel laureate, economist at Harvard, after he reads the Gita, he comes away thinking that Arjuna is the winner in the debate, and that Arjuna's right, he shouldn't fight. Why is Krishna telling him to fight? I think it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Gita is teaching. Because there's killing and there's killing, right? First of all, it's Arjuna's swadharma as a kshatriya, as a warrior. Every country has military. Why? Are you suggesting that we should not have militaries at all? That nobody should fight at any cost? Let's talk about World War II. I mean, would that have been the best option with Hitler? Should the Allies not have gotten involved and tried to defeat Hitler? That involved a lot of killing.
Yes, me.
Well, I'm just saying as an example. I mean, there are some cases when violence seems to be necessary and justified in order to achieve a greater good. If you're fighting for justice right? And that's exactly the context of Mahabharata. That's exactly what Krishna's not saying kill innocent people. He's saying these people are going to do terrible evil, have already done a lot of evil. And you need to put a stop to it. And it's your job specifically as a Kshatriya. He's not telling random people in the street. He's telling Arjuna, who's the greatest warrior in the world, and whose swadharma it is to fight in a just war, on the side of justice. But that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, before the question, I'll make an announcement. Like after this, we'll take the last question because we're running out of time.
My name is Akhil.
Just put the mic.
You talked about how a soul can move from rajas to sattva. What are the changes in the attitudes, and how should a person look at the world? Not as, I mean, you said we should have a transcendental rule also, so that we can move from rajas to sattva. My question is, what about people who are in tamas? How do they move from tamas to rajas?
Right. That's good. Yeah. I think it's important, first of all, to know where you are. So if you're primarily tamasic, it's very hard to jump from tamas to sattva. And in fact, one of the greatest dangers, especially among tamasic people, is justifying their tamasic behavior by calling it sattvic. This is very common. There are two reasons why somebody is spending all day in the room. One is because they're sleeping, which is very tamasic, or they're spending all day on social media, tamasic, or spending all day thinking of the divine, meditating. That's very sattvic. One of the great dangers is mistaking tamas for sattva. And in spiritual life, it's not usually advisable to skip steps. And so if you're very tamasic, it's becoming rajasic. Achieve something, do something, get out there. Have ambitions. Do something rather than nothing. That's moving from tamas to rajas.
Are
Prove to
there
yourself.
any pointers in the Gita? Are there any pointers in the Gita?
Well, yeah, I mean, because it's not just, I mean, I give one small example. The Gita's classification of 3 kinds of sukham, happiness, in terms of gunas. There's an extraordinary taxonomy of different things based on the 3 gunas. 3 kinds of faith based on the 3 gunas. 3 kinds of knowledge based on the 3 gunas. So why is it giving us this exhaustive list, or not but very comprehensive? So that we can figure out where we are. What kind of actor are we? Are we sattvic, rajasic, or tamasic? What kind of worker are we? Are we sattvic, rajasic? So it helps us to kind of categorize where we are, place where we are. And then if we can identify, we can kind of pinpoint. I'm very sattvic in this regard, in this part of my life, but I'm very tamasic in this way. So now we try to be more rajasic and then ultimately more sattvic in this part. You can like pinpoint aspects of your life that need improvement. You see what I mean? Yeah. So it helps us to do this more fine-grained kind of self-analysis. Thank you. There's somebody back there with a hand up. I don't know if, maybe we can just give her the last word.
Namaste, Swami. I have a question. For a student in high school or maybe in college, how do you explain a study and do not expect, or let me go, Karma Yoga says do everything as an offering to God and the results as a blessing from God. So I have twin girls who are in high school. Every week I teach them about this. And whenever they're thinking about college, what college I get, they are always stressed. So I said, do your best, leave it to God. So they say, Mom, what are you talking about? I'm working so hard, I'm doing so much, and if I don't get that, how can I just say that it's okay? Then what goal or purpose can I have in life? There's sometimes they mock me, okay, you can tell at your age when you have already achieved what you want, but I'm just stepping into the light, and if you tell me, don't worry about the result, do your duty. Getting into a good college is my purpose in life.
Right.
So I can to some extent answer, but I still feel that I don't think it's convincing enough. So I find it hard to explain to a 15-year-old that concept.
Yeah, no, I think that there's a common assumption that if I'm not deeply invested in the fruits of what I'm doing, then I'm going to do the work in a sort of more... Yeah, I'll be mediocre, I won't have that motivation to do the work well. And I think the Gita is refuting that. There's another nice loka in chapter 18, 17. Mukta sangona hanvali dhriti utsaha samanditaha siddhi siddhino nirvikaraha karta sattva uchyate. The sattvika doer, karta, is the one who is mukta sangaha, free from all attachments to the work and to the fruits of the work. Anahamvadi, completely free from egoism. So you're not doing it for selfish reasons. But then, the key phrase, dhriti utsaha samanditaha. You are full of dhriti, perseverance. So it's not that you do it in a kind of lackadaisical way or in a mediocre way. You do full perseverance and utsaha, enthusiasm. You see. And finally, siddhi siddho nirvikaraha. But you are equal in success and failure. You won't be completely depressed if you fail, and you won't be on cloud 9 in a very emotionally turbulent way if you succeed. More even keeled, you see. So all of these can be combined. That's the trick of karma yoga, actually. Just because you're not attached doesn't mean that you're not going to have vritti and utsaha. And in fact, some of the best ones are the most sattvic ones, the ones who don't take things too hard when things go wrong. See? They can pick themselves back up and then they keep on doing it again. Yeah, thank you.
Pranam Swamiji. So listening to all of this, personally I think, and I wanted your opinion, Bhagavad Gita Shloka 2.47, Karmaneva Adhikarasti, I feel that in all of this, it seems to be the founding pillar, and the 699 are the supporting ones. What's your opinion?
It's a wonderful verse. I don't think it's complete as it stands. Part of the reason is because the bhakti element hasn't been introduced in chapter 2 yet. See, that only comes in the next chapter. Mayi sarvani karmani sanyasya adhyatma. See, in the verse you quote, karmanyevadhikaraste ma bhaleshuraj, to the work you have the right, but not to the fruits thereof. Easier said than done. How do all of us are attached to the fruits of our work? Chapter 3 gives us the answer. offer everything you do to me. In chapter 9, Yat karoshi yat ashnas yat juhoshi dasya yat tapassikantya tat purusham madapanam. Whatever you do, do it as an offering to me, to the divine. So I think it's incomplete without the bhakti side. How do we renounce the attachment to fruits of our work? Rupa. Thank you. Okay, I think we can let that up.
Thank you, Swamiji. So, I think now I would like to invite Rishikesh in the UI advisor for the vote of thanks.
Hello everyone. I would firstly like to extend my sincere gratitude to Swami Medhananda for gracing our campus with his enlightening effort of all our Hindu Yoga volunteers and members. A special thanks to the staff of NC State Student Centers for their invaluable technical support throughout the event. I would also like to express my immense gratitude to Dr. Samrati and Ramakrishna Vedanta Society of North Carolina for their unwavering support and collaboration. And last but not the least, I would like to thank all of you, the audience, for being such an attentive presence here. Thank you.
Right, last I would like to invite Dr. Vidyanatha Samrati to give a vote of thanks.
Ram to Swamiji, what an electrifying talk today, and thank you on behalf of the society to all of you for coming, and especially to the Hindu Yuva brothers and sisters. Really a brotherly and sisterly love now. We've done a few events now. Swami Medhananda ji is going to give another talk at Duke University on Monday, starting 1 p.m. Seating will start at 12:30 p.m. So please try to be there as well. If you have time, it's a President's Day. Kids have school off that day. And other announcements, we have some snack boxes outside. Please take a snack box on the way out. So our center is in Morrisville, so we are a center. You heard Swamiji talk about Sri Ramakrishna, who is our ideal. Our center is dedicated to the holy trio of Sri Ramakrishna, Paramahansa, Sharadama, and Swami Vivekananda. Please do visit our center if you can. It's in Morrisville. And any other, some of you had some great questions. If you want to know more about Swami Vivekananda, who is kind of the pioneer of bringing Hinduism to the Western world, Hindu Yuva is actually going to have some books outside from Swami Vivekananda. So if you want to take a deeper dive, get some of the books. Thank you.
Thank you, Samratji. And at last, I would like to thank Swamiji for such a great talk, and everyone who will be attending, who attended here at the talk. And it's such a talk, nice talk. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you so much for coming. Amazing.
Namaskar.